Before the day had a name, before warmth returned to the halls of men, the hunter was already on the mountain. In the far north of the Viking world, survival did not wait for sunrise. It came in the sound of hooves on stone, in the sting of frozen wind, in the thin red trail across the snow. Ahead of him, a wounded reindeer fought for the ridge with the last of its strength. Behind it, one man pressed forward through ice, breath, and fear, knowing that a missed chance here could mean hunger later in the dark season. Every step was a wager against the mountain itself. The ledge narrowed, the abyss opened. Wood bent beneath his grip as he raised the bow once more, searching for stillness in a world of motion. But on this land, nothing was ever given easily. The arrow flew, stone broke loose, and for one suspended moment above the ravine, hunter and prey seemed bound by the same brutal truth. In the north, life endured only by outrunning death, and winter always waited below, patient and merciless. Long before the hunt became a chase, it began in darkness, inside a longhouse heavy with smoke, timber, and the glow of struggling embers. In a Viking home, morning was not an hour of ease, but an hour of preparation. Fire had to be coaxed awake. Leather bindings had to be tightened. Arrow shafts, iron points, and the bow itself had to be checked in silence, because on the mountain, the smallest weakness could become a sentence. Around him, the household still breathed with sleep, warmth, and need. A child watched from the furs. An older woman placed food into his hands. No one spoke, because nothing needed to be said. In the Viking Age, a hunter did not leave home in search of legend. He left because winter stood close beyond the fjord, because meat could be dried, hide could be worked, and one successful journey might hold a family above hunger. So when he stepped into the pale northern dawn, he carried more than weapons. He carried the survival of the house behind him and the weight of the season ahead into the open cold at dawn. He left the farm, as men of the north often did, without ceremony, only the quiet knowledge that skill mattered more than hope. Outside, the world was still half asleep beneath frost and mist. He strung the bow in cold air, tested the wind with ash, and took up the short skis that would carry him where hooves could cross snow more easily than feet. Behind him, the longhouse and its thin column of smoke shrank into the valley, a small island of warmth against an immense and indifferent land. Ahead lay the high ground, where signs had to be read in broken earth, in drifting powder, in the silence between gusts. Every choice now became part of the hunt. Which slope to follow, which stream to cross, when to move openly, and when to disappear into the folds of the terrain. By the time the mountains rose around him in full, he was no longer a man leaving home. He had become what the North required him to be: patient, watchful, and willing to enter the cold spaces where survival still had to be earned, step after careful step before the kill. By the time he reached the upper slopes, the world he had known below was gone. The farm, the smoke, the shelter of walls and voices had vanished behind him, swallowed by distance and cloud. Here the mountain spoke in older signs: a split hoofprint pressed into frozen mud, moss disturbed where an animal had passed, a trace of scent carried thinly through the wind. To survive as a Viking hunter was not simply to chase, but to read a landscape so closely that it began to reveal its hidden movement. He moved through sparse birch and over the first reaches of snow with the patience of a man who understood that haste belonged to the desperate. The prey was near now. He could feel it in the silence, in the sharpened stillness of the air, in the way the land itself seemed to tighten around him. So he lowered his body beside stone, fastened the skis, and entered the white high country in near silence, no longer merely searching for life, but closing in on it with every breath, every mark in the snow, every warning the wind chose to give him. At last, the mountain yielded its secret. Beyond the shelter of stone and drifting haze, a small herd moved through the basin below. Quiet, alert, and perfectly made for this unforgiving land. This was the true test of the hunt. Not strength, not speed, but distance, wind, and patience. He watched them the way men of the Viking world had watched game for generations, measuring the invisible line between hunger and failure. A careless step, a shift against the skyline, the wrong breath carried on the air, and the herd would vanish into the vastness before a bow could rise. So he circled with the terrain, keeping low, letting rock and hollow conceal what the open slope would betray. Snow became his cover. Silence became his weapon. When he finally dropped to the earth and set the arrow to the string, the world seemed to narrow to one suspended instant. Somewhere beyond the fog of his breath stood the animal he had chosen. Then stillness broke, and the first shot flew into the cold, carrying with it the promise of food, risk, and pursuit. The arrow did not end the hunt. It began the most dangerous part of it. The wounded reindeer broke from the herd and drove itself toward higher ground, carrying the struggle out of the basin and onto the spine of the mountain. In that instant, the silence of the stalk was gone. Snow burst beneath hooves, stones rolled into open space. The hunter rose and followed, no longer hidden, but committed. In the Viking world, a wounded animal was never merely prey. It was distance, uncertainty, and the risk of losing everything already spent to reach that moment. So he cast aside the ease of skis and climbed after it on foot, reading blood on snow, broken tracks on stone, and the panic written into every turn of the slope. Higher and higher the chase drew him, away from the basin, and toward ground where one mistake could kill as surely as hunger. Ahead, the animal pressed toward the narrowing ridge. Behind it came the man, breath burning in the frost, with no choice left now but to finish what he had begun before the mountain claimed the rest. By then, the chase had become something harsher than pursuit. The mountain had driven both hunter and animal onto a ledge of stone and wind, where the world narrowed to breath, footing, and nerve. There was no herd now, no open basin, no room left for error. The reindeer, cornered above the ravine, turned with the last force remaining in its body. The hunter steadied himself against the cliff and drew another arrow, not in triumph, but in necessity. In the Viking Age, survival often demanded a kind of closeness to death that few could endure for long. A single slip would send man or beast into the abyss below. Yet hesitation carried its own cost. So he held the bow at full draw and waited for one clear moment in the chaos of wind and fear. When it came, the shot ended the struggle. Then, with the violence gone from the air, he approached the fallen animal and finished the task quickly, the northern law unchanged as ever. Take life without waste, and endure long enough to bring that life home before darkness and cold returned once more. With the chase over, another labor began, slower, colder, and no less important than the hunt itself. On that narrow mountain ledge, there was no room for waste, and no time for pride. What had been won with risk now had to be secured with discipline. He knelt beside the fallen reindeer as the wind moved over stone and snow, and the frenzy of pursuit gave way to the old, practical knowledge that kept northern households alive. Meat had to be cut and sorted. Hide had to be saved. Weight had to be judged against distance, daylight, and the long descent still waiting below. In the Viking world, survival depended not only on the kill, but on what a man could carry back from it. Around him, the clouds were already shifting, and the mountain light had begun to fade. There, in the cold silence after violence, he worked with steady hands, turning death into food, shelter, and winter strength. Because in the north, the hunt was never finished when the animal fell. It was only finished when the household could endure because of it. By the time he turned back toward the valley, the weight on his shoulders had become more than burden. It was proof that the mountain had yielded, for one day at least, and that those waiting below would not face the dark season empty-handed. Yet the return was never the easy half of the hunt. The cold deepened, the light thinned. Every step downhill demanded the last of his strength, and still he walked, carrying meat, hide, and the hard-won answer to winter's hunger. When the longhouse finally appeared again through smoke and evening mist, it was not a place of triumph, but of continuation. The load was taken in, the meat hung near the fire, the hide stretched for use, and the labor of one life passed quietly into the life of the household. That was the truth of a Viking hunter's day. Not glory, not legend, but endurance. To leave the warmth, face the silence of the high country, and return before night with enough to keep others alive. In the north, that was what it meant to survive.